So there it is, point blank.
Yeah.
And if people are not paying attention to this, I think he wanted to say that, be honest with you. He's dumb enough he spits out anything, and I think he wanted to say that. So you can go over Your Voice, Your Call, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and on the Twitter pages, you'll see that video. I have it there and on the Facebook page. It's also on my mayoral page. You'll see it there. And check us out, follow us. We want to break that 300 mark real soon. And we are here on PSB every Saturday from 10 to midnight, and on Sundays, currently 2 to 4. And so follow us, check us out. And without you, America, and without you viewers and listeners, we wouldn't have a show. So with that, I'm not going to worry about the closer today. I'm going to let Thumper take over for the next show, getting ready to line up. And it looks like Connecting the Dots is getting ready to come on with Dan. And thank you, everybody, for paying attention and watching. We love you. And I am looking so forward to seeing you all again next time. Good evening, Thumper. Take over. Dan, hello, and enjoy and have a good show.
Chris, thank you. I hope we didn't screw you up. I think we might have. We were trying to get Edwin on to make sure that we had a good connection there, and I hope I didn't screw you up too badly. But Chris, you do a fabulous job. Thank you for everything, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
Oh, I appreciate it. Don't worry, it didn't mess us up. We kind of figured to try to work out the sign. So you guys have a great show, and we'll see you later.
All righty. Thank you. Thumper, I want to thank you for letting me know that Edwin wasn't on the first time, so we did get that squared away. Thank you for that. Today, I gotta tell you,
I'm really excited about Edwin being on today, because with everything that's going on,
oh man,
I'm going to be glued to the monitor here, because with his legal background, this should be absolutely fantastic. So
absolutely,
thank you for being with us today, Edwin.
And I can't honestly think of a better constitutional attorney in the country, someone who really, really understands exactly what's going on with the law and how it's being manipulated, and what we're going to be talking about today. And Edwin, I'll let you really lead into that, but it's the fact that we have the tools. In fact, that's the name of our program today. We have the tools to save America. It's a matter of whether or not we use them. And President Trump has the tools, and they are available. It's part of U.S. code, and we know what's been going on the last 3 weeks between the attempts to steal the election and all the voter fraud and all the things going on behind the scenes. And I have really looked forward to this week's program, because I always get so much enjoyment listening to Edwin. This is a gentleman who knows so much more than 99.9% of Americans, and I love to hear him talk about the things that the ways that we can improve our country. So, Edwin, I'll introduce you. I'm going to do it very briefly. You are a constitutional attorney. You are have 4 degrees from Harvard University, and you are also someone who has taken cases before the Supreme Court, several landmark decisions, and you are someone who I've worked with because of James Yeager and all the different historical documentaries that you've been involved in. Welcome to the show, Edwin, and thank you for being here.
Well, it's my pleasure to be with you, Dan.
I would like you to kind of maybe start out with what you see happening in this country right now, and how you feel about the last month, really since this, say a week before the election, watching the whole process transpire, what your feelings are about the whole thing.
Well, I'm not surprised with all of the allegations, or proofs actually, of voter fraud throughout the country. That was something I think that was to be expected. What I am surprised with is that the Trump administration hadn't prepared for this months ago. They seem to be playing a game of catch-up. It's almost the fourth quarter in the last couple of minutes for them. Sidney Powell, of course, who was very she was very effective in General Flynn's case, far more effective actually than any of the people in the Department of Justice, to be blunt. She comes in, she doesn't become an official part of Trump's legal team with respect to this particular fraud situation. She has to go off on her own, represent other clients in an attempt essentially to do the work that the Trump administration should be doing. So that's on the civil side, that they were completely unprepared for this on the civil side. But you have to remember that not only in the federal side, but on the state side, voter fraud is a criminal offense. On a number of levels, in terms of people who conspire to rig elections, in terms of people who vote in false names, in terms of people who create false ballots, whatever it is. And who is supposed to deal with that situation, the fraud side of this? Well, at the state level, it's the state criminal investigatory and prosecutorial authorities. And I don't think we've seen very much coming out of any of them in any of these swing states. At the federal level, of course, it's the Department of Justice, Attorney General Barr, FBI, right? Go down that whole list of people who have proven to be not quite as effective on behalf of President Trump as I think he would have liked to see or anyone else would have liked to see. So we have an unfortunate situation in which what I think would be the primary means of going after this problem, which is a criminal investigatory means, is not being used. You take Sidney Powell, for instance. She has a couple of suits that I've read, one in Pennsylvania, one in Georgia and one in Michigan, and she's promising to bring suits in some of these other swing states as well. And in those two complaints, and they're civil complaints, she has asked the courts to issue orders for the seizure of some of these voting machines, computers and software and so forth and so on. Now, that's something of a difficult road to hoe early on in a civil case, because typically in a civil case, you go in, you file your complaint, the other side files some kind of motion to dismiss, and assuming that that motion is overridden and the court allows the civil complaint to go forward, then you seek discovery from the defendants. And one of the things that you can get through discovery is the production of tangible things, documents, files, videos, whatever it may be that you think the other side has that are relevant to your case. What then happens typically is before the other side turns those over, it goes back to the judge, or perhaps doesn't go back to the judge, goes back to the lawyer asking for them and makes some objection. Says, well, we don't have to turn these over because these aren't relevant or whatever. We don't have them. We don't know where they are, whatever the excuse is. And then the party seeking discovery has to go to the judge and get an order to compel production of documents subject to contempt if that order is not complied with. So on the civil side, it's a fairly complicated process to extract from a defendant by the plaintiff things along the lines of what we're talking about in these voter fraud cases, particularly when the defendants probably don't want those things to see the light of day. And you would also have to check to determine whether those things hadn't been altered or in some way, some kind of falsification had been injected into the system on the defendant's end of the case. The beauty, in a sense, procedurally of the criminal approach is, what's one of the first things that you do after someone comes forward to the investigators, will sign an affidavit saying, I believe in this case that these machines were rigged or are rigged, or however he phrases it. And so those machines become part of a criminal investigation. What's the first step that's taken? It's a search and seizure warrant. Yeah. You go in and you seize those things without asking the permission of anyone else other than the judge or magistrate who signs off on that search warrant. And one would think that given this problem of voter fraud through computer manipulation has been something that's been in the news. I mean, Elizabeth Warren was one of the ones talking about the mail-in voting and some of these other problems. This isn't something that was suddenly discovered the day after the election. You would think that people in Washington, at least, would have been prepared for this and would have said, oh, if we can find people coming to us during or immediately after the election who will sign on to an appropriate affidavit, then we can seize these things on the 4th or the 5th or the 6th of November, not be fumbling around the way unfortunately, Sidney Powell is doing. She's doing Trump's work for him, but she's doing it on the civil side. She doesn't have the coercive power of criminal investigators. The other part of this is, as well, once some of that evidence has been seized, and you now have an idea of some of the low-level people who were involved in the criminal vote fraud, typically the investigators will bring those people in for a conference and say, look, we have you on a videotape stuffing a ballot box or putting Trump votes into Biden's stack or whatever it is. You're facing minimum of 5 years in prison, actually much more than that, because each count is 5 years in prison on some of these federal statutes. We want you to cooperate with us. And that's typically how a criminal case is broken down. You get the lower level people, they cooperate because they don't want to take the excessive fines or imprisonment, and they begin to testify with respect to the upper level people. You break that whole chain and you work your way as high as you can go. That typically doesn't happen in the civil case, because whatever information you get in the civil case would lead you perhaps to another civil case, or lead you perhaps to joining other people as parties, but you're stuck at the beginning of a civil case with the people you've named as the defendants. And you may have named the wrong people. You may have named the people who really weren't the ones who were involved in particular actions that you're claiming were part of the fraud. So it becomes problematical. I look at all of this and I say, what in heaven's name were Trump's legal advisors, the ones in the White House, and then the ones outside of the White House in the ambit of the Department of Justice, let's say, what were they thinking of as they approached this election? Why weren't they prepared for this? When I used to litigate complex civil cases, we would prepare that case 8 months, a year ahead of time. Who were the witnesses we needed to call? What were the arguments we needed to make? So forth and so on. All of that would be laid out before we filed a complaint, so that we knew fairly well what we were doing and what we anticipated and what we anticipated the other side would be doing. This looks like, it's like a catch-up team, right? It's like seeing a bunch of people at the basketball court at the park, dividing themselves up into teams to play the game. There doesn't seem to be any coordination on the part of Trump's people on the civil side with the criminal side at the federal level. There is no coordination, as far as I can see, between the Trump people and various state people that would be filing the same type of charges, either criminally or civilly. And Sidney Powell is out there, the one person in the whole Trump administration that did what she said she was going to do. She's out there in left field, right, by herself, with essentially no support except what she can obtain through the internet. And I think that's a very sorry situation for which, unfortunately, Mr. Trump is in charge. He's responsible for this. Now, these people in the Department of Justice are not independent. If you go back to the Constitution of the United States, it imposes on the president, Article 2, Section 3, the duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. If he didn't have an attorney general, if he didn't have an FBI, which was, of course, the case when Washington came in, none of these things existed.
All right.
The president of the United States himself would have been exercising that power directly. He would have been the investigator. He would have been the prosecutor. All of those things that would be done on the executive side of the process. Congress created these various agencies in order to assist the president in performing his constitutional function. He always retains that constitutional power. None of these people below him have some superior power. None of them is independent. He could walk into Barr's office tomorrow with 2 file folders, one red and one green, hand in the green one and say, come back in a week, or maybe less now. Come back day after tomorrow with the search warrants and so forth that are going to be filed by the Justice Department to get this information. And if you don't, we'll open the red folder, which is your resignation. It's really as simple as that. And none of that is happening. And that's what I find incredible.
Well, I have to say, Edwin, one of the reasons that I wanted to get this program on the air is the fact that we do have people who are pretty active in the Trump administration who do occasionally tune into our programs. As a matter of fact, I've had correspondence with a couple of them this week. And I'm hoping that they will be listening to your advice and to your legal advice on this, so that we start to turn this program around. Because I agree with you. After you sent me the information on U.S. Code 253, it's pretty clear that the president has not only the right to use the criminal code, he has the responsibility to use it when things like have been happening over the last 6 months, 8 months. He has not only the right, but the duty to do that. And I think it's probably time he needs to hear that.
Well, it's in a sense, it's past time because, of course, we're running out of time. There's the open question that arises: what happens if fraud is determined? Let's say it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, determined by the Supreme Court, so we don't have any other appeals. Fraud in this election is determined after the Electoral College has voted and Biden-Harris administration has won. The Biden-Harris ticket has won. Do you unzip that process and go back? Can you possibly say that you can have a person in the office of president who was elected through fraud? Is that conceivable? Are people going to say simply because they get past some deadline in the normal process that if it's discovered shortly after that the election was fraudulent, all of that cannot be reversed? See, it raises all sorts of constitutional,
sure it does.
Difficult constitutional questions. And I look at this also from the point of view of who is the real victim in this situation?
The American people.
Yeah, well, every voter who obviously voted for Trump, and in a sense, every voter who voted for Biden, because that voter was made a part of a fraudulent proposition. We're not going to blame that individual voter, but essentially had an honest election taken away from him too. It's Donald Trump himself personally, right? He is being deprived of his civil right under the Constitution of the United States to be fairly elected to the office of President of the United States. Okay, he is the number one victim. He is the target of all of this. I'm not the target. You're not the target, except indirectly. He's the direct target. Have we seen a case yet where Donald Trump is the lead plaintiff? I don't know of one. And why isn't there one? That's number one. Number two, that's on the civil side. That's Title 42 of the United States Code, Section 1983. And that he can bring those cases from now until the cows come home, until the statute of limitations runs out. And I imagine there will be many people bringing those types of cases, no matter what happens in terms of the inauguration of the Biden-Harris administration, because people have been deprived of that civil right, and they can sue indefinitely until the statute of limitations run out. On the other side, on the criminal side, there are two statutes, Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 241 and 242, which talk about the criminal deprivation of civil rights. If we have a fraud conspiracy here, then there is a criminal deprivation of Trump's civil rights. And one would have thought that the first thing the Department of Justice would have done is, let's use those statutes because they're specifically designed to deal with this kind of a problem. Then, of course, the one you mentioned is a bigger picture. That Title 10 of the United States Code, Section 253, that deals with combinations or conspiracies or insurrections, goes on a list of things that can happen within a state where state officials do not appropriately respond. They don't do their duty with respect to that problem, which is some of the things that we're seeing in these various states. The state officials are not performing their proper constitutional and statutory role under state law, and as a result, they are violating federal law or have violated federal law or enabling federal law, enable violators of federal law to get away with it. Under those circumstances, the president can come in, and that statute talks about the president by using the militia or the armed forces or both or by any other means. Now, he could come in and begin a criminal investigation on his own by bringing in people from the militia or the armed forces or other means. He doesn't even have to depend upon Attorney General Barr.
It's literally unlimited, isn't it, Edwin?
Not only is it unlimited literally, there was a similar statute that came to the Supreme Court, and the question was, who had the discretion to determine when the facts were sufficient to exercise power under that statute? The statute that gave power to the president, similar to this one. Supreme Court said, the only person that has the power to exercise that discretion is the President of the United States, and no one can second guess him, including the courts. That's the famous case of Martin versus Mott. Well, maybe not famous, but it's there anyway. Written by Joseph Story, one of the most famous justices in the Supreme Court's history. So that is, in a sense, the biggest club in the president's golf bag in this particular case. And from what I've seen, nobody has suggested that he used that. I find that one incredible. Not even to threaten the state officials, in a sense, to tell them, if you don't get on the ball here, and begin doing your own criminal investigations, your own civil lawsuits, I can intervene and take over within your state and do your work for you. Now, I would think that that would be rather an incentive for some of these state officials to stand up and do what they're supposed to do.
Edwin?
But we also have the possibility of a state bringing a suit, because some of the states whose electors would go for President Trump are now in the position where their electoral votes have been diluted because of frauds that were committed in other states. If a state brings a lawsuit in her own name, where can that lawsuit start? In the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court of the United States has original jurisdiction when a state is a party to a lawsuit. All right, you start at the top and work down in a sense, because what the Supreme Court does is they don't hear trials. I mean, they don't go through evidence, so forth and so on. They take the case and then they hand it off to a special master of some kind. It might be a lower court judge, it might be a person appointed to act as a trial court essentially and do all of that low-level work before the issues finally get to the Supreme Court. But the point is, the case gets into the Supreme Court directly. And in many of these instances, what are the plaintiffs asking for? Well, they're asking that certifications not be had. They're asking that ballots and other information be sequestered so that it can be investigated. Sidney Powell is asking for computers to be seized by the court so they can be subjected to forensic analysis. And when you're going through the civil process, there are all of these steps, one after another, until you finally get to the Supreme Court of the United States. If a state were to bring this kind of a suit, the Supreme Court would decide those initial issues right away. Right? You'd file that complaint, say, Mr. Supreme Court, please give us this immediate emergency relief, and then send the case off to a special master for determination of the facts and some kind of report on what the master thinks is the appropriate legal determination. Right? And at least you'd get some of that factual material, the evidence, as it were, in the hands of the court through compulsion. You wouldn't be waiting for the possibility that you wouldn't get it at all, or that it would be turned over in some truncated form or falsified or whatever. No.
Right.
So I haven't seen anyone suggesting that route either. So we look at all of this and we say, wait a minute, to a certain extent we have not the plaintiffs who have the greatest interest. They are two. They're number one, Trump, number two, the states, right? Because the whole system is built on the federal process. That's why you have electors coming out of the states and the state legislatures having control of the local elections. The states are in this. This is not a raw democracy like Athens or Corinth or something, in the old days of ancient Greece. It goes through these different governmental levels. So you have Trump number one because he's the target, and then number two, whatever states there would be, whose electors were selected for Trump, who are now going to be defrauded of that ability to cast those votes with an equal weight, kind of equal protection problem, because of what's happened in these other states. And because of what's happened in these other states, because in some instances, state officials have taken the wrong road or have neglected or have failed to exercise their own authority. We got this amazing situation in Pennsylvania where they're now saying that there can't be a challenge to the illegality of the mail-in ballots under Pennsylvania Constitution because people waited too long.
Yeah.
Okay, the kind of latches argument, right? Now, the first rule in constitutional law is if a statute is unconstitutional, it doesn't exist.
Doesn't matter,
as a law. It's not there, right? There's no question of waiting. Now, there might be some statute of limitations. You take an example, 42 U.S.C. 1983. Statute of limitations there on when you can bring a civil rights claim depends upon so many years after the occurrence. Well, even that type of a statute wouldn't apply here because we're weeks away from the election, not years. So it's, I mean, this is incredible stuff that's going on. And I just look at it and say, I can't believe it, in the sense that really competent lawyers would have been prepared for this. They would have assumed this kind of thing was going to happen. And they would have said, how do we go about attacking this? Well, Mr. Trump has to bring a lawsuit. Well, certain of these other people, voters have to bring a lawsuit. Republican committees have to bring a lawsuit. A state or states might have to bring lawsuits. That's on the civil side. On the criminal side, we have these possibilities, and we have lurking in the background the atom bomb solution of 10 U.S.C. Section 253. None of that's been done.
Edwin, I know Thumper had something he wanted to ask you, but when we get back to this discussion, let's play the devil's advocate here, and we say that the Trump administration wakes up and they hear your comments and they decide to put Dr. Edwin Vieira, a constitutional attorney, in charge of this case. I would ask you to kind of map out what you see as the best approach. If you were the quarterback for this team, if you were the guy that was in charge of this whole process and you had President Trump's ear directly, how would you advise him as the general in charge of this legal process?
Well, I think he has to go back to what Sidney Powell is trying to do in gaining control over these computers and software, videos of what was going on during the counting in some of these states and so forth. That key, vital evidence. How is he going to get that evidence prior to the deadline of the Electoral College? I should say a deadline. I mean, it's a schedule. It's not necessarily a deadline. That deadline seems to suggest it's final. But you don't want to complicate the case by going beyond these timelines. Then it gives more reason for courts to think, at least, if not to say, well, we can't undo this. It's really too late. We'll come up with some fraudulent evasion scheme, standing or something, say you don't have standing to bring this lawsuit. That's the first thing he should have done. And how is he supposed to do that? Well, I think you have to open a criminal investigation. I think just what Sidney Powell has developed is sufficient to give you this reasonable suspicion, probable cause, and probably even beyond that, to get search warrants, search and seizure warrants. That's all he needs. Go and find these things, get them. Find out where those people from Dominion have disappeared to. You find out that their entries on Twitter and on Facebook or whatever are gone. They've left town, the offices are gone. What's going on there? I would also, internally, open an investigation within the FBI to determine whether this electoral fraud operation is not tied into the bloody CIA. Because what Sidney Powell has developed is that this is an internationally run operation. It's been used or intended to be used in many other countries, perhaps starting with Venezuela, maybe before Venezuela, we don't know, but certainly as far as she was concerned, starting with Venezuela, for the purpose of rigging elections. Well, who would have a greater interest in that than our own beloved CIA? Are they involved in this? All right. There are all sorts of Pandora's boxes that need to be opened. Then I would tell President Trump, you have to bring a Title 42, Section 1983 lawsuit in your own name. And we'll run that lawsuit as long as it takes. Right? And then in a
criminal action, correct?
Well, that's a civil action, right? Okay. And then we want the Department of Justice to start going in and finding the people that we're going to name. The original thing I talked about, seizing the records and the computers, those are going to be search warrants. That's how we're sure we get them, right? In his own civil suit, he would ask for all that material also as part of discovery when the discovery process begins. And then put together, I think, a more comprehensive how shall I put it, forensic analysis team. There are a number of people out there that I don't think Sidney Powell has mentioned who have done work on voting irregular from a statistical point of view, mathematical point of view, probability point of view. These anomalies and irregularities and impossibilities even in the way the votes have been tabulated, the way the votes came out of the timelines and so forth and so on, and begin putting all that together, because ultimately, whichever court you go to, criminal or civil, you have to meet a burden of real evidence. Either it's preponderance of the evidence in a civil case or beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal case. And where are you going to find that? More likely than not, I think, is through expert analysis of what went on here, especially if they get their hands on the software. All right. And that's the key to the whole business. Evidence. If you don't have the evidence, you can't develop the facts. If you don't have the facts, your legal theories are simply speculative. And you get dismissed on that ground. Because that's what the media is trying to spin to everyone. There's no evidence. There's no evidence. They've produced no facts. Now, they have hundreds of affidavits. And I find it amazing that anyone in the media does not know that an affidavit, signed affidavit, sworn under penalty of perjury, as they all are, is not evidence. It's always sufficient evidence for things like a search warrant. It's always sufficient evidence in a civil case in certain. You can win a civil case simply on the basis of affidavits. You don't necessarily have to have a trial, right? So they're trying to convince people, look the other way, forget about this mass of facts, and in the middle, we'll muddle it up in the judicial process with decisions such as the ones coming out of the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court. And everyone will be so confused out there that they won't know what has happened. And the only way to solve the problem from the political point of view, psychological point of view, is simply, oh, we give up, we'll just accept this. Trump, leave the White House. It's now the Biden-Harris administration, and that's it. And it all goes down the memory hole, like the Kennedy assassination, the two Kennedy assassinations, the Martin Luther King assassination. We can list a whole slew of these. A
litany.
Right? Which, if they were allowed to go long enough, enough people became confused, enough people became disheartened, enough people became disinterested, so they essentially said, what the heck, we don't care. Let's just get on with our lives and move into the future, forget about the past. And all the consequences of those events, we're still living with. All right? And what do you think the consequence is going to be of this election being accepted in principle by the courts when at least 70 million people believe it's fraudulent? What does that do to the political stability, social stability of the country going into the future? Well, I'll tell you, especially if we have a lot of people out there, voters. How many Trump voters are there? Every one of those Trump voters theoretically could bring a civil rights lawsuit in his or her own name against various defendants in different states, challenging fraud in the election, because every one of those voters, according to that theory, has been deprived of the full weight of his or her vote. You could make a cottage industry of this. This could go on for the next 4 or 5 years with lawsuits being filed. And they only have to be filed within the statute of limitations. They don't have to be decided within the statute of limitations. So if you're taking a state where, say, there's a 3-year statute of limitations, because they go by the state law with these federal cases. There's a 3-year statute of limitations. You get it filed within 3 years. Well, you're already 3 years into the Biden administration. And then the suit's going to drag on for another 3, 4, 5, 6 years in appeals all the way up to the Supreme Court. This thing will never end for the Biden administration. If they really had a desire to quell the problem, they would be the ones first and foremost going out and say, let's see what actually happened here. Let's get those Dominion people and some of those other people that were involved with the computer side of this alleged fraud. Let's get them into court and let's find out what actually happened. Otherwise, the legitimacy of that administration is going to be zero. I mean, their own people will think it's legitimate, but you can't run a country when half of the country believes that the government is illegitimate.
Well, Edwin, this is the first time in history that we've had as many people waking up to the fact that our country is literally under attack, and we are on the verge of losing the constitutional Republican form of government that our founders envisioned because of this kind of voter fraud, this kind of internal fraud. Now, we have, and of course, the term is the deep state, but we have, through President Trump, discovered just exactly how corrupted the system is, and the fact that there's two sets of laws. There's laws for you and me. We could refer to it as the little people. And then there's a whole different set of laws for those who are the power elite, who are in charge of our country. Talk about how we can separate that and get back to the point where we have rule of law for everyone. Is there a way that can happen? Well,
number one, it's very difficult in principle if the elected officials are going to be selected by your opponents constantly. In other words, if you don't have fair elections, if they can determine who are writing the laws in the legislature, who's signing the laws as the executive, who's interpreting the laws in the courts, because the courts are the product of the executive and the legislature, right, in terms of the identity of the judges, you don't have much say in the process in reality, right? It's a dumb show. It's a Stalin type system, right? They give you the electoral list. These are the people you vote for, and it doesn't make any difference because they're, of course, Stalin's people. That's difficulty number one. Difficulty number two is, I suppose, there's a great deal of misapprehension of what people can actually do still. I mean, this is a good example. As I said before, fraud on a massive scale in an election opens up hundreds or potentially thousands of lawsuits. And you keep bringing it in the courts, state after state after state. Eventually, these cases are going to get to the Supreme Court. There's no way that that can be avoided. They'll have to take them. And then what happens? All right? That's what really fascinates me. Say 3 or 4 years down the road, the Supreme Court says, well, that's right. You know, there was fraud in Michigan, there was fraud in Wisconsin, there was fraud in Pennsylvania, and so forth and so on. And as a result of that, the man who really won the election was Donald Trump, right, who's now living in Mar-a-Lago or someplace, right? He's in retirement. He was the man who actually won the election. And this fellow who was in the White House, Biden or Lady Harris, they were usurpers. They weren't properly elected. And therefore, every piece of paper they signed, including statutes and so forth, that's all illegal. You think of that, the possibility. This is, there's an old legal saying, which essentially, let's see if I can get the Latin correctly. Fiat justitia pereat mundus. Let there be justice though the world perishes. All right? Let there be justice though the world perishes. And that then becomes the alternative here. So what I would say is, what are we going to do? Well, number one is always education of people. And now, as you say, Dan, more and more people are waking up to what the problem is. Then they have to start making some demands at the local and state level, because what we're seeing here in many instances is that state officials, even Republicans, are allowing this to go on. I mean, voter fraud is not something that's new. It didn't just happen in this last election. It's been going on for decades and decades. Let's go back to the Nixon-Kennedy.
No, even Tammany Hall, sure.
Oh, yeah, but I'm just thinking of the big one. The one that was in my life, that was Nixon and Kennedy, and people would come and say, well, there was fraud in Illinois, there was fraud in Texas. Over there. And Nixon, maybe rightly or wrongly, he said, well, I'm not going to challenge this because I don't want to create a constitutional crisis. At least that's a story that's told by some of the people who were around him, right? He didn't come out and say that directly, but that's what they said. That was his real reason. It would have caught. And I thought back to myself later on, I said, poor Nixon, didn't he realize that he had created a greater constitutional problem by allowing this to happen? If Kennedy had been elected through the machinations of fraudsters in Illinois and in Texas, how was that not a greater constitutional crisis than challenging the thing on constitutional grounds? Because now you've accepted the possibility that in the future, people are going to, as they're screaming in the media, concede. We're going to concede rather than challenge. Well, we don't want that. We never concede. You never give up. So it has to start at the local level, state level, and get control of this electoral process. And that means seriously enforce it. My God, I would say electoral fraud, 25 years in prison. That's it. You file under false name, you falsify a ballot, you do something with the computer, we see you, we catch you, 25 years in prison. That's the end of it. No appeals, no nothing. 25 years in prison and you go. Because if this process isn't controlled, if this process isn't made transparent and accountable, then everything else that follows from it is tainted. And the state officials have to do that because all of these elections are either state elections or they're run through the state mechanisms, right? Congress has a very limited authority to come in and make determinations of how state elections should be run. And the courts have a limited authority because they can only come in after the fact and take a look at how particular statutes were or were not enforced or were not unconstitutional. So it's the state officials, the legislatures, and the executives. And they're the ones, unfortunately, that to a large extent are part of this deep state operation. I mean, they're a little bit lower on the totem pole, lower on the ladder, but they're still part of it. So that's number one. Then number two, at the top level, I think Trump has got to give us an example now of someone who is actually standing up to follow Article 2, Section 3, to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And I'm talking here about all the laws, because if you put someone in to the presidency who's not properly elected, if you put a usurper in, and I'm not saying that Biden was part of some conspiracy, right? Biden is simply someone who gets into that position because of illegality done by someone else. Nonetheless, he's not supposed to be in that position. Right? And then you ask the question, well, everything that he does in that official capacity is now tainted. Where does that lead us? So Trump now has a responsibility. And what I see him doing is he's just standing back and letting his various legal advisors tell him what to do or tell him what not to do in some cases. In the case of Sidney Powell, don't bring Sidney Powell onto the team. And that's, he's not, what was it? It's Teddy Roosevelt, the bully pulpit. That was the presidency. Teddy Roosevelt said, well, if I have the presidency, I have the bully pulpit because I can speak directly to the people, get my ideas across, because he was talking about policy more than anything else. Well, now Trump has, in a sense, the ultimate bully pulpit, because everyone in the country is hanging on his every word with respect to this election.
Right.
We're not talking about simply political policies that you and I may not be interested in or shouldn't be interested or whatever. We're talking about, as you said, the very survival of the country, because the survival of the country depends upon the integrity of the electoral system. And not only the integrity of the electoral system as a system in terms of being on paper, but the integrity of the electoral system in terms of the officialdom enforcing that system, which they're not doing, at least not effectively doing. It's like fish flopping around in water. You've got the Giuliani group bringing their lawsuits. You've got some other people bringing their lawsuits. You've got Sidney Powell bringing her lawsuits. No coordination there. And then number two, no serious criminal investigation. Well, I was going to say, that's what interests me, because that will all disappear. All of this business of the investigation of the Mueller, the Russiagate, the Flynn, so forth, all of that, when Biden comes in, that will go. You'll never hear about that ever again.
Absolutely. And his son and all the illegal actions by the Obama administration, Hillary Clinton and the Steele dossier, all of that stuff will get swept aside. We'll never hear of it again. And that is exactly why this has to be tackled. If we don't do it now, there's no tomorrow, as far as I can tell. I mean, this is kind of it.
Well, you're in quicksand. That's what I would say. You're in political, legal quicksand. And typically in quicksand, the only way to go is down, unless somebody throws you a rope, right, and pulls you out. So who is going to do that during the Biden-Harris administration? Well, certainly the Democrats aren't going to do it. The media is not going to do it. The only people, the election's gone. What's left is the challenge to the election by people bringing these lawsuits, constant lawsuits. I say the cottage industry of voter fraud litigation. And I think that's going to happen because a lot of people are so stirred up that they simply will not tolerate this result. But the problem then becomes, well, you still haven't solved the electoral integrity situation simply because I bring a lawsuit and I establish that some election officials in the state of Virginia engaged in some kind of voter irregularity. And they deprived me of my civil rights because I voted for Trump and Virginia, of course, went for Biden. What do I get out of that? Well, I get a judge's determination that my civil rights were violated, and maybe I get some monetary damages against this person who was in that particular position. And that's it. Does that change the whole systematic problem that we face? No, but it's one little piece in terms of building up a tsunami of political opposition. More and more people, and I'm not talking simply about the Trump voters. What about all those people kind of in the middle? I mean, they didn't vote for Trump because they don't like him for this reason or other. They voted for some third candidate, or maybe they even voted for Biden. And they look at this and they say, wait a minute, we've all been cheated here. It's not just the Trump people have been cheated, it's all of us. Right? So those are the two ends of it. At the lower level, I think you have to have people taking direct action, and I would think a lot of it's going to come through the courts. At the top, and for a very short length of time, it's got to be Trump himself and the people around him, if he can get them to, act properly.
One of the problems, if I can just interject here, is I've actually heard of people that have gone and talked to lawyers, and if you're going to bring some kind of action, you need a legal representative that will actually take the case. And there's a lot of them out there that absolutely refuse to take the case. Now, where do you go when you have that kind of a situation, Edwin?
Well, not only are there plenty who refuse to take the case, but they'll also have their handouts. For what? Money. This is an expensive proposition. You think bringing a federal civil rights lawsuit is some afternoon exercise? Oh no, it goes on for years. All right, so you better have a big checkbook, and you better have an even bigger bank account under those circumstances. Now, there are some people who will do that because they are involved with litigation organizations. All right, that defend people's, and I'm not talking about the ACLU because they won't get involved in this, but that will defend people's civil rights. So you'll get some plaintiffs who will have the deep pockets of those organizations. You can have some people such as myself. I'm a lawyer. I have nothing better to do. All right, I could bring a lawsuit on my own behalf, or on behalf of members of my own family if I wanted to. So, but there's your problem. And the point that you bring out is a very interesting one now, that in the past, one would never have heard threats to destroy the careers or the lives of lawyers because those lawyers were bringing unpopular litigation. Right? Think of the civil rights era, the classic civil rights era, 50s and 60s. There were lawyers all over the country bringing civil rights lawsuits, which in some parts of the country were very unpopular. Right? But you didn't hear the mass media talking about in one way or doxing those lawyers, having them brought up on ethics charges in their state bar associations, which of course the left-wing media and punditry is now talking about. I find that fascinating, this idea that if you go out as an attorney and you represent, well, Trump, because some of Trump's attorneys dropped out, didn't they? Mm-hmm. Okay, there's at least one law firm that dropped out there. But if you represent some other, such as myself, I get some lawyer and he represents me to bring this kind of a lawsuit, and then he suddenly discovers himself under pressure on Twitter and Facebook and in other ways that forces him to say, well, no, I don't want to represent this guy because it's too much of a threat to my other clientele. It's too much of a threat to my firm's reputation and so forth. Well, what do we have there? And you see, there's another example of what this has now led to. An attack on the integrity of the legal system. Mm-hmm. Because the legal system is supposed to be one that, no matter what your claim, no matter how disreputable you may be, there is supposed to be some lawyer who will take your case, right? That's the system. And if we can't find one that will take it on a paid basis, we'll find one who will take it on a pro bono basis. Oh, here in Virginia, for instance, they recommend that 2% of a lawyer's time be spent on pro bono litigation. That is, he's doing it for free, right? But, well, maybe not if he's representing someone who's taking Trump's side in this electoral fraud business. And so there you attack another institution, which at least in principle is vital. Mm-hmm. The ability of people to have representation through the courts, not simply the existence of the courts, because the existence of the courts doesn't do it. You have to have the representation, effective representation, to use the courts. And now this segment of the political structure in the country, the left segment, is saying, oh, no, we don't want you to be able to use the courts. Mm-hmm. And they're picking Trump, of course, because he's the whipping boy at the present time. But there are plenty of other issues they don't want you to use the courts about.
Right. Right. Well, as a matter of fact, I can't imagine a more perfect time if you were going to do pro bono or work representing the heart and soul of the country. I mean, we're talking the most important subject in the world, which is a fair and equitable system of being able to elect our president. Now, how in the world you think about the kind of threats these people must be facing to walk away from that, even on a pro bono basis, because this, if you're a patriot, there isn't anything more important in the world than this.
No, and I find it amazing that the answer that those particular law firms didn't give was, well, this is our ethical obligation.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Exactly.
You can't tell us to forego our ethical obligation because you don't like the politics of the people we're representing. I mean, that's what I find incredible. But money talks. The problem, and money talks in another sense too. If you bring one of these lawsuits and you're challenging electoral fraud on the basis of some of the things that Sidney Powell was talking about, the computer rigging of the election, the statistical impossibilities and so forth of the way the voting patterns worked out. Who are your witnesses? Well, they're probably not the defendants. It's probably not the defendants who are going to come forward and say, oh, yeah, we rigged all this stuff. We'll tell you how it worked. It's going to be experts. Mm-hmm. And one thing you find out if you've done any litigation, such as I've done a lot of litigation involving experts. Experts are expensive people. All right. First, you have to find ones that are good, so that they can't be discredited because they've said this and the opposite and so forth and so on. You got to find people who really know what they're doing. And people at that level require a fair amount of compensation to do their work, especially because you're asking them to do specific work in your specific case. You're not asking them simply to go in front of a jury and read from a book that they wrote 5 years ago. You're asking them to analyze evidence in your particular case with very serious consequences to their reputations as well as the result in the case. So you better have a fair amount of money. You better be able to pick those experts, which means you have to have lawyers who know their job. And then you have to be able to find experts who are willing, for various reasons, to testify, to analyze a case and then to testify, because ultimately they'll end up having to testify. And then you have to work with them. Right? The lawyers have to work with the experts as much as the experts work on the case, because the lawyers have to understand as much as the experts do. Otherwise, they're going to be in serious trouble. Well, that's very time consuming. The lawyers might give pro bono to this, but it's very unlikely that these experts will want to do that.
I think there are some out there that might be willing. No,
that's fine. I'll say, yeah, you find them. You say you can go and find them. But that's one of the problems. Some lawyer comes forward with a client and says, hey, we've got a great case here on paper. Now we need expert A, B, and C, and D in these areas. Now we have to go out and find those people, and we have to find those people who work at a reduced rate or pro bono. Because the client I'm talking about is not someone who has so much money that he can fund the case. All right.
All right.
So there are all sorts of practical problems in this, and that's why I say Trump is in the perfect position, because number one, he's the primary victim. Number two, he has terrific public perception,
support.
Public see him, right? Number three, assuming that he brings this case in his own name, so that he couldn't rely upon funding from the government. He's not bringing this as president of the United States, bringing it as Donald J. Trump. He's a multimillionaire. He can pay for all the lawyers and experts he could possibly want, right? He's the perfect person to bring this case.
Well, not only that, there are quite a few of us that have been putting as much money into his defense team as put into his campaign. I can attest to that personally. I've done that myself. So, Edwin, again, I want to get back to you're the general on this. You are the guy that's saying, okay, Trump, here's what we need to do. Here's the first thing you need to do. Here's the second thing you need to do. Here's the third thing you need to do. This is the way we've got to map this out. Talk in those terms.
Well, the first thing, as I said before, is we have to get our hands on the evidence. And this is a criminal case. Let's use every criminal procedure that we have, investigatory, seizure of documents and so forth, and get moving on that right away. We've got to get our hands on those materials before they disappear, before they're altered, before software is changed, whatever. Right? Then number two, also on the criminal side, we have to find out where these potential defendants are. As I said before, some of these computer people, where are they? Right? Get our hands on those people. Right? And then also make up a list of other potential criminal defendants. and then begin that investigatory process right now. And begin it, I would say, in a way that tells the people that we're doing it. Right? This isn't something that's going to be in the back room. We've started this process. We're doing this, we're doing this, we're doing this. Okay, that's number one. Then number two, they have to sit down, all of the various legal elements in this case of bringing the civil suits, and come to some resolution here about, what shall I say, cooperation, coordination of the lawsuits, because they're running off in different directions.
Right.
And I've seen this in civil litigation where you have one group is bringing a lawsuit and another group says, yeah, that's an interesting issue. We'll bring a lawsuit for our people over here. And the third group comes, and to a certain extent, they're working in a counterproductive fashion. They're not all cooperating and working in the same direction. They're spreading their resources and potentially creating situations where there may be contradictions.
Right, conflicts of interest. Sure.
Well, not something conflicts of interest, conflicts of arguments. All right. And also you find the situation where one party may bring a case that isn't too good. It gets a bad judicial decision. The second party brings their case a little later. They have a much better case, but their judge simply says, oh, well, there was an early decision on this. I'm just going to go along with what that judge said. I'm going to throw it out. You see that all the time. All right. And that's one of the problems where you have a lot of people bringing lawsuits in a, how shall I say, in a sense for other reasons perhaps than the ultimate winning of the case. Oh, yes, they want to be able to say that they brought a lawsuit. Right? We want to act fast, find a lawsuit, but you don't develop the lawsuit properly. So you need coordination on the civil side. And I would say, if you look at all the cases that are out there, the one that seems to have the most potential behind it, or the direction, is what Sidney Powell's been doing. Because she's really getting down to how this was done. All right? You've got a lot of people that have come up with analyses instead of the vote pattern and so on, and they say, well, we can see that it was done. And somehow it was done by a computer system. And Powell is saying, well, I know which computer system it was. And I can tell you some of the people behind this. And I can even tell you where it began. And that then raises the very interesting question, which, again, the Trump administration has not put forward. There was a national security issue here. All right? Remember, they went after Trump because of some murky connections with Russia, whatever that was in Russia. Right? That was the Russiagate thing, right? It was all nonsense, okay? Putin interfering in the elections. And they never showed how Putin had interfered with the elections, right? This was all a myth. Well, we know how somebody interfered with these elections, and apparently we know that this goes back to Venezuela originally, Cuba, and of course China, because China has tremendous influence now in the Caribbean. You talk to anyone who understands Venezuela and Cuba and so on, and they'll talk about Chinese involvement with those people. Right? Ever since the Chinese were given the Panama Canal way back when, right? Remember that, okay?
Right.
So we have a possibility here that the Chinese have some influence. That's a national security problem. And it's also a national security problem because certain foremost candidates and members of their family have had financial dealings with the Chinese.
Edwin, I'd like to bring up another point, and that's been brought up, is Trump has talked about treason. Now, when you're talking about treason, that isn't adjudicated in a federal court. Isn't that adjudicated through military justice?
If you're in the military.
Especially if you're in the military. If you're an enemy combatant, if you've been designated as an enemy combatant, which was an interesting question that was raised in the Kavanaugh hearings when he was being screened for his appointment to the Supreme Court. I am thinking that there's a possibility that a lot of these key players, especially at the top, maybe find themselves in front of a military court.
Well, I would be very leery of that, because I think a lot of what's been touted as enemy combatant and so forth has been a ruse to get around limitations on the criminal justice system under the Bill of Rights. martial law, there is no basis for the thing called martial law under the Constitution of the United States. It's an extremely dangerous concept once you go down that road. Extremely dangerous. Keep the military out of this entirely. Right? The Founding Fathers, one of their great bête noirs, if you know what I'm talking about, was what? Standing armies. Mm-hmm. They were desperately afraid of standing armies. Right? And unfortunately, we have a very large standing army. Navy, Marine Corps, whatever. And this huge so-called defense establishment tied into the deep state. All right. You don't want to give them any more influence than they have now, especially on the side of their being able to adjudicate political wrongs or criminal wrongs or civil wrongs on the civil side. Stay away from that.
What if it's looked at as an attack on this country's sovereignty and? From the inside,
you've got enough under Article 3, definition of treason, right? Mm-hmm. It's either levying war against the United States or giving aid and comfort to an enemy. That is, you don't have to have a war if you give aid and comfort to an enemy. All right. So if there's Chinese involvement in this process, illegal Chinese involvement in this process by American nationals, because the people have to have allegiance to the United States to commit treason. A Chinese national can't commit treason against the United States. You have American nationals involved with Chinese manipulations of the election. You have an arguable treasonous situation. Mm-hmm. But then you have to do it in open court, and you have to have 2 witnesses. So we get back to the evidence, right? To get the evidence, you get the computers, you get the people that program those computers, you get the people in those companies that knew what they were doing, one of which said, I think in Detroit, that people didn't have to worry, Antifa didn't have to worry because the fix was in, right? We get those people, and we interrogate them in the normal way that the FBI or state prosecutorial officials, investigatory officials interrogate people. You present them with the facts. We have evidence against you that could send you to prison for 50 years. Do you want to cooperate? Do you want to make a plea bargain? We follow that process. That's a process, unfortunately, that takes a certain amount of time. And she asked me what should be done. If I were there, I would be telling Trump, let's get Barr in here this afternoon. It's 11 o'clock now. Get him in here at 2 o'clock and have him come back at 4 o'clock with exactly what he's going to do with the FBI.
That's exactly what I'm asking.
What are they going to do? And what are they going to do? And if he doesn't have the answer by 4 o'clock, by 4:30, he's fired. And we'll put somebody else in there who will give you the answer. And you know how we can do that? Title 10 of the United States Code, Section 253, the president, by any other means, shall take such measures as he considers necessary. That's the statute. And we'll go find some people in various states who are competent prosecutors. And we'll bring them into this operation in the White House. And we'll tell those people in the FBI and the deep state and Justice Department, we don't need you anymore. All right? We can bring people, anyone we want, by any other means, as he considers necessary. The militia, you know who the militia is?
People.
Well, that's right. Well, no, not quite. In Virginia, we have a thing called the organized militia and the unorganized militia. The organized militia is the National Guard. I don't want to get into that. National Guard is not a militia. It's a different thing. It's part of the standing army, right? The unorganized militia is everyone else from 16 to 55 who was an able-bodied resident citizen of Virginia or an alien who's in the process of becoming a citizen. Now, you don't think that I could find in Virginia alone a couple of dozen people with prosecutorial experience, investigatory experience, forensic experience in the computer world? You think I couldn't put up together a team, 20 or 30 people, to perform this kind of function that Barr won't perform, that Ray won't perform? Of course we could. How many states are there? Well, let's leave Montana out, Idaho, the states that have very little population, but all the states that have population equivalent to Virginia. How many people could we put together behind Trump to perform such measures as he considers necessary? Several thousand, perhaps? Could that be
100,000?
10,000, maybe? I want to talk about people who have real knowledge, right?
Edwin, I hate to tell you this, but Montana probably could come up with a couple hundred.
Well, whatever, okay? But I'm just looking at population, percentages, percentage-wise, all right? You could come up with thousands of people if he would simply use this kind of an approach. And he wouldn't have to rely upon Barr or the person who might be promoted to him as Barr's successor. Remember, Barr was supposed to be the successor to this whole bunch of incompetence going back to Sessions, right? Barr was the guy who was going to take control of this situation. And what's he done? He's still waiting for, what's the fellow who's performing that investigation, whose name escapes me, the other prosecutor was.
I know who you're meaning.
Yeah, we're still waiting for that. That's been going on for what, a year and a half? We're still waiting. We haven't heard anything about that, except I think he claimed he was going to indict one very low-level individual. Well, they don't have time for that. Here's a statute that allows him to bring in potentially thousands of people. My God, if I had been the president, I would have been preparing the secret executive order and the proclamation, because you have to come up with a proclamation under these statutes. Way back when, I would have done it somewhere at the beginning of 2020, knowing that I might face this. All right? Now, I wouldn't have signed it, but it would have been prepared. So if the case had and I would have had my people going to Virginia, Montana, wherever, let's find the experts. Let's find the people with prosecutorial experience. Let's find the people who have investigatory experience, forensic experience, because this is what we're going to face, ladies and gentlemen. I'm talking to my little group in the White House. This is what we're going to face, the possibility that there will be major voting fraud. And we want to be ready for that. And there's only one way to be ready for that, is to have the team already assembled right there in the stadium. They know each other. They know what they're supposed to do. So when they go on the field, they're not playing catch-up football. All right? Okay, so he hasn't done that yet. I think he could still do it. I think he still has time to put some people together, because he knows where he has to go. He has to go into Pennsylvania. He has to go into Georgia. He has to go into, Michigan, maybe Wisconsin, Arizona. We're talking about, there's 5 states, and that would determine the election, right? Certainly if he had all those 5 states turned around. So he knows, all right, and here's what we have to do in those states, because the Giuliani team that he has in the White House and Sidney Powell outside of the White House have already done a lot of spade work as to what needs to be extracted as evidence and what individuals need to be, or what types of individuals need to be targeted as potential defendants, criminal or civil. And so Trump puts together this particular team. He can get them from anywhere he wants, and he divides them up. So many go to Wisconsin, so many go to Michigan. Go straighten this out. And he gives them authority under this statute such that no state official could countermand what they are required to do. All right? That's Article 6, Clause 2 of the Constitution, Article 6, Clause 3 of the Constitution, right? So laws of the United States, and this is one of them, 10 U.S.C. Section 253, are supreme over the laws of the state, and the state officials take an oath to support the Constitution.
To support that.
All right? So this is a powerful, powerful tool. And remember when we had all of the protest situations, the looting and the rioting and all these.
Right. That's what I saw, what this USC 10 USC 253, and that was the first thing that came to my mind. This is a perfect way to end that kind of craziness.
And what was interesting there was that when those things were going on full bore, some people were saying, well, Trump should use the Insurrection Act. Well, there is no Insurrection Act. They don't know what they're talking about. There are a number of statutes in a chapter in the U.S. Code, a title in the U.S. Code called Insurrection. That's just a title, all right? And the one they were talking about was actually 252, Section 252, not 253. So he didn't even have that straight. And I often looked at that and I said, wait a minute. 253 is the one that's applicable here, because you know why Section 253 was written? It was written after the Civil War to deal with the Ku Klux Klan. And if you remember the Ku Klux Klan in its early days, the Ku Klux Klan was closely interfaced and integrated with officials in the former Confederate states. Civil War is over. They're reconstructing these governments. They become civil governments, and a lot of the people that were in those governments, justices of the peace, local sheriffs, whatever, had been Confederates or Confederate sympathizers. And so they were serving as, mayor of the town or justice of the peace during the day, and then they were putting on their white robes and riding with the Klan at night to burn down black churches and terrorize the freedmen, as the former slaves were called at that time. Mm-hmm. So Congress comes in and says, we need to deal with this, and we need to go over the heads of the authority of these state officials, because they're the problem. The state officials are not doing their job. In fact, they're part of the Klan and other activities that we're trying to suppress. So that's what this thing was written for. It was written for the situation where the federal government could not depend upon state and local officials to enforce state laws so as to protect federal rights. And that's exactly the situation. Now, that's also exactly the situation that occurred in Portland, Minneapolis, you run down Chicago, you run down these various cities where the riots were going on, and no one, this is what amazes me. I don't know whether it's stupidity or it's craft, that I never heard anyone mention Section 253. 10 U.S. Code Section 253. Nobody. Not in the Trump administration, not in the conservative media, right? Nobody. They were all talking about this other statute, when in fact what was going on in those situations was the riots were allowed to continue because the state and local officials were looking the other way or actively participating in some way with the rioters by telling the police to stand down. Section 253 was the statute made for that situation.
Made for that.
All right? It was made for that because that's what was happening in the late 1860s with the Ku Klux Klan. Okay? And so we had, in a sense, a resurrection of the way the Klan operated. But instead of wearing white robes, they were dressed in black this time. Right? Instead of the Klan, we had Antifa, and then we had the neo-Confederates, if you will, the nullifiers. The secessionists were the governors and mayors in those areas which were looking the other way or actively behind the scenes contributing to it. Now we have the same thing at a different level. Vote fraud. Who runs those elections in the states? The states do. The localities and the states do. Ultimately, the states do. And they are public officials. All of these electoral authorities are public officials of one kind or another, and above them are the ones who are supposed to be supervising them, all the way up to the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, the Governor. Some of whom we know, the Attorney General in Pennsylvania, right? We know there's an example, classic example of someone who apparently is looking the other way. He doesn't seem too concerned about voting fraud, right? So we have a classic example from a different perspective. Instead of the Klan riding roughshod over people, the night riders, we have a different kind of night riders. They're the ones who are bringing in boxes and boxes of phony absentee ballots at 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning.
Right.
Right? And they're the ones a lot more sophisticated than Nathan Bedford Forrest ever was. They're the ones who have rigged the voting machines, the computer-generated voting tabulation and so forth. All right? We've got a much more complicated situation to prove than finding someone wearing a white hood. But it's the same principle. And here we have a president who is obviously the target of, what shall I put it, disloyal individuals within his own administration. Disloyal individuals in the whole deep state operation. And the FBI is part of his administration, right? We're not talking just about people in the White House. It goes all the way down there. And then the problem at the state level, where he's not getting very much support. He's getting support from individuals, but he's not getting very much support from the high-level state officials who are digging into this from the top down the way they should be. So here's the statute. I look at it and I say, my God, what does he have to lose?
I agree.
What does he have to lose? Well, I'll tell you what he has to lose. Not only his own position, he has to lose the whole bloody country. Right? Because if it is now accepted, we're going to acquiesce in and let's just put to one side, as any lawyer will tell you, we don't know how this is going to come out. We have allegations, we have certain proofs, we have legal theories, we have to put this through the grinder of the system to find out how it comes out. But right now it looks as if, and that's why these cases are being brought. All right? The lawyer says, I have enough so that my ethical obligation is fulfilled. I'm not bringing a fraudulent case or a fictitious case or a frivolous case. That's where we are now. And if people refuse at every level, from the general public, John Q. public, all the way up to the President of the United States, to do everything that is necessary to get to the bottom of this, then this will never end. And that means the country will end. So, Dan, you're right. This is it right now. This is it.
This is it.
This is it. Okay? And it may be worse even than we're talking about because of the possibility that there's foreign involvement, real foreign influence,
right?
Maybe even directive influence,
Global
right?
influence.
That's right, influence in this to subvert our electoral system, so as to subvert our political system, so as to cause this country to move in the direction that these foreign influences want us to move. It might only be China, which is bad enough, but it could be even a bigger proposition when we start talking about all the ramifications of globalization, the great
Agenda 21. Yeah,
that's right,
yeah.
Agenda 12, or whatever they're calling it. Right. I think they're calling it now the Great Reset.
2030 or the Great Reset.
Yeah, the Great Reset. Okay. So there are people out there. There are people out there that have plans for us, for the deplorables. And our only hope now as deplorables is to use what we have. And the main thing we have, like it or not, is Donald J. Trump. He's the man in that position. He's the man that's been backed up against the wall, and he has nothing to lose. So,
and he has a tremendous amount of national support. In truth, I think we recognize that he very well could have the majority of the country behind him, even if they don't like certain things that he does.
Oh, that's right. That's right. I mean, I can imagine many people that don't like him personally or find him personally objectionable one way or another, who look at some of the things he's done from the economic point of view before the COVID business came up. And then on the other side, they look at what the Democrats are proposing, which is the opening door to a vast socialist experiment. And they say, well, okay, I'll hold my nose, but I'll still vote for Trump. There are plenty of those people, right? So you're probably right. They're probably, from an electoral point of view, that's of course what these cases are saying, Trump won. And probably from an absolute majority point of view, he probably has support in the country. And so that's what we're looking at. We're looking at a coup. This is kind of a classic coup, because all coups are done by what? They're done by minority groups. They're done by small groups, right? And they're done to a certain extent in secret. This one is a little, more of it came out, I suppose, than they wanted to come out. But what we're looking at is a coup, and it may be a coup that is directed or at least promoted in some way by foreign interests. And it's a coup, the purpose of which is not simply to change the person in charge in the White House. It's to change the country radically.
Absolutely.
I don't think, if you go back to the Kennedy-Nixon experience, and leave aside, I don't believe John Kennedy was involved in vote fixing. But what was really involved there? You were going to get Nixon or you were going to get Kennedy. There wasn't going to be some radical change in the direction of the country. And neither one of those people was going to be influenced by communist China,
right,
which existed at the time. All right. Now it's just the opposite. You get one of these people in, and you're going to have radical changes in the direction of socialism, if you will. And you have the problem that the whole operation now may have, in some sense, been, how shall I put it, been influenced, let's just say,
compromised
by foreign powers. Well, sure, it's obviously been compromised. Right? But that's why I use influence. Influence, they got what they wanted, right? So I go back to those. You tell me what needs to be done. Trump needs to do what I suggested he needs to do. Sidney Powell has to keep going and receive more support, because she's obviously proven that she's someone who's tenacious. And she did that with look at Flynn, look at the Flynn situation.
Oh, yeah.
Nobody stood up for Flynn. Nobody, until she showed up. And then what did she do? The first thing that she did was she asked for the so-called Brady material. Brady versus Maryland case, Supreme Court said, prosecutors have to turn over to defendants in criminal cases any exculpatory material to be found in the prosecutor's files or to which the prosecutor might have access if he went to the police or whatever. Right? Now, what was amazing was, where was that material before Sidney Powell showed up? General Flynn didn't have it, did he? Now, that's the first thing a criminal lawyer asks for.
Yeah.
Right? What is it? I want that material. So she was able to get that, and she was tenacious. She took the little bit that she had at first, and she dug into that, and that led her further and further and further, and she ripped the whole facade apart and essentially forced the Justice Department, finally through Barr, to come in and say, this was an improper prosecution to begin with. We don't want it dismissed. And then, of course, the deep state's judge, Sullivan, for whatever reason, decided that he was going to do things that were simply unprecedented, and that still, potentially would still be going on if the pardon hadn't been given. But you look at her background in this, and you say, well, my God, she was the only one that was worth a thimbleful of cold spit during that whole process. Right? So she needs to have a lot more support. And then I think what needs to be done, and the third point is what I said earlier, we have to have a lot of people to make this thing continue. A lot of people bringing these lawsuits on behalf of voters in particular. And I would, if I were Trump, I would be talking to some of my friends in Texas, name a couple of other states that went solidly for him, and say, listen to the governor and the attorneys general. And I said, you people have got to bring a suit on behalf of your state to challenge this. We've got to go directly to the Supreme Court. We have to take the atomic option, and that's the atomic option in the judicial system. You go to the Supreme Court directly, and there's the only person that can do that, or the thing that can do that, is a state in this situation, because states have the original jurisdiction. The Supreme Court's extremely limited. So you're starting at the lower level with Trump because of his position. You're starting at this other level with the states, because they can get directly to the Supreme Court. And in the middle, you're working all of these civil cases, especially what Powell is doing because of Powell. And then you're also working criminal cases, not only at the federal level, but at the state level. And so if I was sitting there in the Oval Office, I'd lay this out. It'd be on one piece of paper. This. And then the next piece of paper is who's going to do it. Right. Let's find the names. Who are we going to put in these blank spaces? All right. And then the third level is, of course, if you get to Section 253, how are we going to recruit these people in the various states? Who is Trump going to send from, whatever Republican apparatus he can use to go into various states and recruit those 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people that we need to perform this function? Simple. Good. On paper, very simple.
Well, and I'll bring up another subject, and that's the fact that most of these swing states that were in dispute had Republican legislatures. Why in the world haven't those Republican legislatures stepped forward and demanded this sort of thing?
Well, that's right, because they have constitutional authority to do various things. They do. That would be very valuable here. Some of them are talking about it. I think some people in Pennsylvania, the ones who are in Georgia, talking about it. But we'll see, right? And of course, then the problem becomes, and this is the quirk in the system. Oh, sure, they'll do something, and then the Democrats will come in and challenge them in court, and so you're back into the court cycle. Right. You're back in the court cycle. Okay, you have to live with the reality that the judicial system, plods along at a glacier-like pace, very, very slowly, and that's why I like the Trump approach, having Trump bring the lawsuit, because now that's a really serious lawsuit. We know who this fellow is. He's not some obscure Republican committeeman, right, from downstate Pennsylvania that may be bringing the lawsuit. It's President of the United States in his individual capacity. And then states bring it directly in the Supreme Court of the United States, because that's the highest level that you can go to in terms of, aggressive behavior, if you know what I mean, right? Taking the bit in your teeth. And then the criminal prosecutions, because one thing certainly has to be done. You have to put the fear of God into these people. And nothing puts the fear of God into someone that, look at the statute. Here's a statute right here. Just brought a couple of them. 52, Title 52 of the United States Code, 20511. So people don't believe that I'm just making this up, right? And it says, a person, including an election official, who in any election for federal office, and then it lists all the things that they might do that are wrong, okay? Defrauding, procuring false registrations, procuring, casting, or tabulating ballots that are known to be false, fraud, all this business, all the fraud type of stuff we're hearing, shall be fined or imprisoned not more than 5 years. So for each count, it's 5 years. I wonder whether each fraudulent, say they did, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There are 6 different things they could do under this. And for each one of these things, there could be thousands of fraudulent votes. Well, let's just say they did this one vote of each of these 1, 2, 3, 4,
30
5
years.
5 years.
Yeah, 25.
They were 25 years. They're facing 25 years simply for one instance. Now, you think some low-level public official thought this was a game he was playing, is going to face 25 years because some superior in the party apparatus told him to do that?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, please. No, absolutely not. And this is something you have to come out with. We're investigating this. Here, that's this one. Here's another one over here. Oh, this is another one for 5 years. Then there's conspiracy against civil rights. That's 10 years. Then there's Title 18, United States Code Section 371, committing an offense to defraud the United States. Is the United States being defrauded of its rightful president?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, this is another 5 years. So let's see, 5, 10, 15, and 10, 25 years for each count right there.
Mm-hmm. And we're talking hundreds of thousands of counts, probably.
Yeah, thousands of counts. So you go to jail for the rest of the life of the universe. You never get out. Okay?
Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, if you're facing that kind of a sentence, I would think you'd be a flight risk. You'd never get bail.
Mm-hmm.
Once we grab you, you're in. You're in forever. And you're not going to Club Fed where you're going to play shuffleboard in the afternoon. We have another place we're going to send you.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Guantanamo.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. In any event, you come out with that statement. We are looking into this. We've got a task force here that is going to look into fraud, and we intend to prosecute to the full extent of federal law everyone we find from the bottom to the top. So all of you people out there, this is implicit. So all of you people out there who want to avoid 25 years in prison, better start thinking of what you're going to say.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, Giuliani, I wondered, see, Giuliani, how did he make his reputation? He was a big prosecutor in New York. He went after whom?
Mm-hmm.
The mob.
The mob.
Right? The mob. That's number one, RICO. And those are complicated cases because they usually involve accountants. There's money laundering, there's bribery, there's blackmail. It's all behind the scenes. It all has to be ferreted out in some way. Sometimes they get informers. Sometimes Sammy the Bull Gravano, spills his guts so that he can get a lesser sentence. But typically in those cases, it's pretty complicated evidence development that you're trying to get because, of course, the mob and the people connected with them are very sophisticated. They know how to hide things in shell corporations and through different accountants and so on. All right, so Giuliani was an expert in all of this. I wonder why he isn't heading up the criminal investigation prosecution team for Trump.
Yeah.
Why is he wasting his time in civil cases? You can get a dozen lawyers that are as good as he is for those civil cases.
You think there's a chance that he's actually doing that with a group of people that aren't so in the public eye?
Well, I would hope so, but the time runs out. And you remember what they did to Roger Stone? Right, Roger Stone. It had a white collar charge against him, essentially trivial, if you send nothing at the level of national voter fraud. And what did they do? They sent a SWAT team at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning with coverage. Was it CNN or one of the media people had gotten a leak, and the leak, they had been told to show up, spotlights and everything, as if they were raiding the biggest crack dealership in the United States. They went after him with that.
And it was multiple SWAT teams because they had FBI as well as local SWAT teams.
Yeah, they had the whole panoply of police state operation with this guy. And what he did was trivial, absolutely trivial compared to what's going on in any one of these swing states. So why hasn't there been at least one of those arrests in any one of these states?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I just look at Sidney Powell's complaints and all of the affidavits she has attached to him. I say, oh my God, I can't believe that a first year, someone who just passed the bar this year and became a low-level attorney in some prosecutor's office couldn't get a search warrant or an arrest warrant based on some of the stuff that she has there.
Mm-hmm.
Why hasn't it been done?
Well, that Edwin, that Dominion official that did the video on, or the Facebook page on talking about to Antifa. I mean, if that isn't something that's criminal, I don't know what is.
Well, he will say, I'm just blowing smoke, I'm just talking to these people and trying to show myself to be a big shot. What I would want to see the computers, the software, and every piece of paper, email, text message, video recording, audio recording in those corporate headquarters. That's what I want. All right? And if you can tie allegations of voting fraud, type of thing that Sidney Powell is developing, back to the corporation, then aren't you entitled to go into that corporation and seize all documents and tangible things relevant to those allegations? I would think so.
Absolutely, yeah.
I would think so. And certainly if you're not going to arrest people connected with that corporation, you can certainly call them in for interviews, as the FBI calls these things, right? Call them in and let's talk about this.
Mm-hmm.
Right? What do you know about this? What were you doing? Right? And maybe they'll bring lawyers. Maybe they'll take the Fifth Amendment. Okay, that's fine. That's their right to do. But then that tends to solidify your suspicion.
Exactly.
Something's going on here. All right. But the first thing is to get your hands on the documentation, because that's the key. And that's what she's looking for. She's asking the court to do that. Not only the computers, I guess she wants videos from some of these places where they were manipulating the paper ballot. The difficulty in a civil case, I said earlier, is you have to jump through a number of hoops before a court will grant that kind of relief in general. And she's asking for it in an extraordinary fashion. It should be done immediately. All right? Because normally what happens is you file a request to produce documents after the case is filed. The other side has a right to come in and object, and then you go to the court and say, give me a motion to compel. It's way down the line. She's asking for this motion to compel to be granted, in essence, right at the beginning of the case. And I can understand why she's doing it.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, but it does leave a certain amount of leeway for a court to say, well, you're not following the right procedure, Mrs. Powell.
Is there a possibility, Edwin, of bringing President Trump using his power as the president to, let's say, ask the court on behalf of Sidney Powell to take it from a civil to a criminal case? Is there a way to do that?
No, they're two separate tracks.
Okay.
Absolutely two separate tracks.
And there's no way. Yeah. Okay.
No, he's got to go through the investigatory process, identify the individuals or entities, because you can file criminal charges against corporations as well as individuals, find out who those people are, and then do the investigation. And then what's his next step? He has to go to a grand jury, or he or his people have to go to a grand jury. But it has to be an indictment. So that's a separate process entirely from the civil case. You don't just file a criminal case in court. Civil case, you just file in court, generally speaking. Criminal case, you have to go through the process of investigation, get sufficient probable cause for the grand jury to indict. There's an old saying, who was it? I can't remember the exact fellow who said this, made it famous. Somebody in New York, some prosecutor in New York way back when said, grand juries, you can get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Remember that? And the reason for that was that the grand juries are given only the evidence, generally speaking, only the evidence that the prosecutors want them to see. Normally, the targets of the grand jury are not willing, or the lawyers tell them, you don't go in there and testify in front of those people. You keep your mouth shut. You take the Fifth Amendment, right? We'll wait for the trial. So the grand juries are, in a sense, they operate to a certain degree in the dark, because they don't see the exculpatory material. They only see the inculpatory material. Well, I look at Sidney Powell's filings with all these affidavits. Imagine if all of those people were to testify in front of a grand jury. Do you think you might get a grand jury to think that there's some smoke behind, where there's some fire behind this smoke?
Right. Okay.
Easily.
So I don't know, dumbfounded isn't the word. I just don't understand why that wasn't the initial tack that was taken.
What do you think of the idea of because we here at Patriot Soapbox, we follow a lot of different things. We dive down a lot of different rabbit holes, and one of them is the information possibly gathered by National Security Agency and the through their monitoring of everything. We know they do, and being able to at some point bring that in as evidence once they have necessary other evidence that will basically one supports the other. You know, the known evidence, and then being able to come in. Let's talk about the servers that were in Frankfurt that they supposedly seized.
Oh, sure. And Spain.
Yeah.
And yeah.
And the fact that they actually, from what we've heard, there was an actual firefight between rogue CIA and good guy forces over there when they went to seize those. 5 of the good guys were killed, and 2 of the CIA rogue forces were, and that was a story that I read earlier on the channel earlier. I mean, there's plenty to show that there's a lot of, outside influence coming in from other countries on this stuff, and and we know the CIA.
Well, that's why Trump,
NSA tracks all this stuff.
That's why, let's take this story that you just said you heard. A firefight between the rogues and the good people, the different elements in the CIA over these servers. Question number 1, where's the server now?
Supposedly in our hands.
Yeah, well, our hands. Yeah. Who's at Trump's hands? Trump's people's hands, okay?
Right.
All right, well, why hasn't this been announced? What's he waiting for? I mean, this is like a bombshell. The American people, nobody believes, media doesn't believe it, CNN says there's no evidence. We just had a firefight in Bahrain between rogue CIA agents whom we've identified, Jones, Smith, and Allen. Right? Some of our loyal people were killed. We named them. And here's the server. It's in the Oval Office in the White House. Look at it. And we now have this team of forensic experts, the best computer people in the country. They're in the next room. And they're going to be investigating this thing. And it's not going to leave the White House because under Title 10 of the United States Code, Section 253, I have called up 500 members of the unorganized militia of Virginia because they happen to be closest. And they are here under a presidential executive order to guard this thing and make sure that nothing happens to it until we've done all the examination necessary. Now, if I were the president of the United States, remember Franklin Roosevelt? I love Franklin Roosevelt because Franklin Roosevelt, I have a Social Security card when Franklin Roosevelt was still alive, and it says at the bottom, not to be used for identification purposes. Right? Now, that was Franklin Roosevelt's, that was his promise to me, and Hillary is channeling Eleanor, so maybe if I could channel Franklin, I could, be protected on my Social Security number. But what was the first thing Franklin Roosevelt did when he came into office at, well, I would say the meta-political level, the higher level? He started his fireside chats. Remember that? The Franklin Roosevelt fireside chat. This was something absolutely new. It was the use of radio for the president to reach directly to the American people. And it was quite workable here because there were a lot of radios in this country. A lot of Americans had radios. And what was the first subject of the first fireside chat? It was the bank crisis. Yeah. Right? The banks had been collapsing under Hoover. Roosevelt comes in, and Roosevelt closes the banks. We had a bank holiday by executive order, proclamation, all right? And he had to explain this to the American people. He said, this is what I've done, and this is the reason I've done it. You people didn't understand, or maybe you don't understand, the banks don't actually have your money there in a shoebox. They've loaned it out. Those loans are long-term. It'll take time for the banks to get that money back. Just wait for a while, because if we all try to get our money out of the banks, close our deposits, the banks will collapse. And it's for the good of the country that I've done this. We have to keep the banking system working. And we're going to correct the problems because I have legislation I'm promoting in Congress, okay? That's what he did right away. And that, I understand from what analysts say, political historians say, that calmed a lot of fear on the part of people. They now understood, this is being taken care of. Maybe we don't have to worry as much as we thought we had to. Now, Trump has avenues of communication far superior to anything that Franklin Roosevelt could have imagined, let alone used. So here we have this situation with the computer and CIA agents, good and bad on different sides, shooting it out. You think that might be worthy of something equivalent of a Franklin Roosevelt fireside chat by Trump?
Boy, howdy.
Yeah, tell the American people, this is how serious it is. We're not talking just about a few people there at a polling center who were manipulating paper ballots and putting Trump ballots in the Biden pile. We're talking about a conspiracy that goes all the way to, where was it, Bahrain? Or wherever, Frankfurt, Germany, Bahrain,
yeah.
wherever it goes. It's international. It goes all the way there, and it's gotten to the point where rogue agents of our government are shooting it out with honest agents. This is how serious it is, ladies and gentlemen. You raise the political ante, right? This is not a joke. This is not just a bunch of Twitters back and forth between Trump on the one side and deranged celebrities on the other side. All right? And he's done none of this. And I look at Franklin Roosevelt, I don't think what Franklin Roosevelt did with the banks or the monetary system, the gold standard and so forth, was wise at all. He made some very serious mistakes there. But he was quite correct that he needed to bring confidence back, and he needed people to have confidence in him personally, that he was capable of dealing with this. And I don't think someone who just, flies off the twit or whatever you call it in these Twitter things really inspires confidence.
What about his rallies?
What?
What about Trump's rallies?
Now let's look at those. What do those show? That there is a tremendous body of enthusiasm and support for him, his policies, and against those people who have been attacking him, right? Because there's always an enemy, right? There's a good guy and there's always the bad guy somewhere. We know who the bad guys are. What that also tends to show is the unbelievability that Joe Biden is the most popular president in the history of the United States.
Oh, no kidding.
All right. I mean, let's face it, that's kind of a layman's approach. That's not scientific, right? But you just look at it and say, this is something I really can't believe. But Trump needs to, fortify those people and energize those people and make them understand that he is really going to do everything he can possibly do in their interest. It's not just in his interest, it's in their interest, because he's the president of what? Of the United States. He's not the president of Mar-a-Lago. He's not the president of Donald J. Trump personally. He's our president. He's the country's president. He's going to do everything that is necessary. And he has to speak directly to them as to what he's doing and why he's doing it.
How does he do that with a media that will take every opportunity to pull the plug on him?
Well, he's got, Franklin Roosevelt, of course, he had the media on his side in the sense that they broadcast his fireside chats, right? They didn't try to censor him. NBC didn't put on, some other program while Roosevelt was speaking. I'm not sure exactly how to do it because I'm not in the IT field. I'm not a propaganda operator. Okay?
Well, we'll invite him over to Patriot Soapbox anytime. I'm sure Dan would love to have HAT as a guest.
He prepares something. He puts it out live wherever it can get out live, wherever his IT people can get it out live. And then they take the videotape of that and they shop it around the country. I mean, please don't tell me that they can't find ways to get that thing in front of every last adult person in this country if they wanted to do it.
No, and I think you're right, Edwin. I think that's an important thing that the president needs to do, because I can tell you, I've seen him on various media at different times talking very earnestly to the audience, and he is a tremendous public speaker. I mean, he is so good at that, and I think this is a very important time for him to do exactly that.
And to make it clear that he's in charge.
Yeah.
He's not just sitting back and letting some advisors that he has kind of go off this way and that way, and then they'll tell him what they've done or haven't done. Or what. No. He's the man who's in charge. He's the man who's directing this. And also the seriousness of the situation, but that he is confident that he can overcome it. And you're showing here, at least on my screen, there's a picture of Trump, and behind him is a picture of Chesty Puller, the very famous Marine. And of course, Chesty Puller was involved in the Chosin Reservoir fight during the Korean War, as remember. And O.P. Smith, who was the general in charge of the 1st Marine Division, of which Puller, I think he was a colonel then, Puller was a regimental commander. O.P. Smith was asked by some correspondents when they were surrounded by the Chinese, are you retreating? Is this a retreat? And he said, hell no, we're just advancing in a different direction. Which, when you're surrounded, I guess is always the case, right? And they fought their way out of that, and they got back and saved the 1st Marine Division.
We're completely surrounded, and we got them right where we want them.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's the attitude Trump has to say. These people have blown their cover, all right? And we may be surrounded now, the media, the wolves of the media, all around us, stuff, but we're going to just advance in a different direction, and we're going to deal with them effectively. That's what I want to see out of him. And then I'd like to see him go to somebody like Giuliani and say, Rudy, or what's his name there, DeGenova, another one. DeGenova, that lawyer, and his wife, but DeGenova in particular, former criminal prosecutor, quite effective, famous.
And very good.
Yeah, I remember him when he was in that position. And Trump come to those two and say, listen, you guys have got to get over here. We've got plenty of civil lawyers that can handle that. We've got that lady that's always on there in that in this civil deal. I can't remember her name now. Janet something or other. She's constantly talking on the internet. We'll leave her in charge. You two people, you move over here and you run our criminal investigation team. And then I, Trump, am going to go under this statute with some friends of mine, and we're going to start raising people from the states to deal with it at that level. And then, of course, we have the civil cases going on in Sidney Powell and so forth. And we're going to see that continuing as well. And then I'm going to go to the state governors, attorney general, who are solid on my side, and I'm going to see if we can't work up a state lawsuit in the Supreme Court of the United States directly.
Get it there right away. Yeah.
Right away. Well, that's something that can be. It's really simple, because the state comes in just like a voter and says, the state, have been disenfranchised of the effect of my electoral votes because of this fraud out here, which has generated more electoral votes for the candidate I'm against, the state I'm against. Right? And that's your classic voter fraud situation. The voter comes in and says, something happened here that diluted my vote, canceled my vote, and therefore there's a violation of some law. So that is not something that's going to require, I would hope, more than, let's say, a week. Let's give them 5 working days to put together. You probably want to get a couple of lawyers that might have had some experience in original jurisdiction, exactly how you set this thing up. But in terms of the merits of the case, the basic legal argument, you're just substituting a state for a voter, basically. It's the same overall proposition. And then you get the thing filed with appropriate fanfare. And now what happens? Now the ball suddenly shifts to the judiciary in a big way. Now they have to fish or cut bait. You got to put pressure on the other side, positively or negatively. You got to put pressure on things like the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, get that thing up to the U.S. Supreme Court and see if it can't be reversed. You got to put pressure on the Supreme Court directly. Why? Because they don't have to take these cases coming from the lower courts.
By the way,
and they also they already have precedent on that because they did it in Florida.
Yeah, that's right. So they have a precedent one way, but they have an avoidance technique the other way.
By the way, I'm reading in the chat here, breaking, Judge Timothy Batten issues order to freeze all Dominion machines in Georgia. Update, judge reverses order within hours. That was a breaking from one of our chatters.
See, somebody made a phone call. Let's not say that. Okay. He comes up one way, and then within hours he changes his mind and says, I was wrong. Oh, okay. But that's the problem with the civil litigation.
Yeah.
There are also, I haven't read what he said, but there are all sorts of ways that if I were a judge and I wanted to avoid coming into the crunch of taking these computers, issuing an order, I could say, well, Mrs. Powell, you didn't follow the right procedure. Go back to the drawing boards. I mean,
and it all wastes time.
Yeah, it wastes time. And it gets it out of my court for a little while. And meanwhile, something else may happen. Right?
Right.
Whereas if you follow the criminal approach, the things are seized, and that's the end of that. And then let the owners of that stuff run into court and see if they can get some kind of order returning them. And that's where Section 253 comes in, because it says the president, by any means that he considers necessary. Martin versus Mott, the Supreme Court decision. I, as the president in control of that criminal investigation, would tell that court, no, we're keeping this stuff until we've done the forensics. This is a measure I consider necessary under this statute.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's see what happens.
Okay, Edwin, I'm gonna stick my neck out here a little bit, but let's just say that there are people on this radio program following this podcast that have the ability to contact President Trump and tell him, we need Edwin Vieira in charge of this whole criminal investigation. We need him as an advisor. Are you ready to step into that role?
Yeah, well, I can be an advisor. I don't know if be in charge of a criminal investigation, but I can certainly do some advising, sit down with some of his people and review the strategy or absence thereof. Of course, they better send an armored personnel carrier for me, because on the way to the White House, I'd get assassinated. So, let's face reality here. Sure. I think one of the difficulties of doing that, Dan, is, there's turf here, right? These people in the White House have done what they've done, and I don't think they're going to be very happy if somebody comes in, some interloper, carpetbagger, as it were, comes in after the fact and says, well, you did a lot of things wrong. Or you did a lot of things too slowly, or whatever it is. You should follow this, and then you're going to get into internal disputes. I'll be perfectly willing to be advisable. What I have said here is, and in other places, is, I think, pretty straightforward and pretty obvious.
Yeah, pretty spot on. Yeah.
I don't think you need to be a Harvard Law School graduate. In fact, you better not be a Harvard Law School graduate in this case. I don't think you need to be a Harvard Law School graduate to have figured out what I've said, and to have seen that it isn't what's being done by the people who are there now, and that they need to, let's put it this way, tweak. They need to tweak what they're doing now, and they need to start up the chainsaw over on the side of criminal investigation. Yeah, they need to really move with that. Now, it may be behind the scenes somewhere that Barr has initiated something, although he's got to go through Wray as the head of the FBI, so I wonder. And we may see something coming out shortly. All I can say is, from my perspective of this, knowing how difficult it is sometimes to get evidence, tangible evidence, because you can usually get people to testify in civil cases, but to get tangible evidence, when that evidence is solely, when the nature and amount of that evidence is solely under the control and the knowledge of your opponent, it's difficult to do that in a civil case, because they don't always turn over what they're supposed to turn over.
Right.
And in Flynn's case, they didn't turn over initially the Brady material that eventually Sidney Powell made them turn over. So you're looking at a process immediately, you say, oh my goodness, this is going to take time. And the quick way to get around that is the criminal approach, because you get your affidavit for search warrant and then you seize. And that's the thing that, they don't need me to advise them on that, because I would go in and say, what the Hades are you doing?
Yeah.
That would be my advice. I just say, what the Hades? Why hasn't this been done? Get me a list of the people who didn't do this, so that we can find out how we can fire them as quickly as possible, or ask them who told them not to do it. All right, we'll start another criminal investigation.
Yeah.
That's why this thing is so bloody important, not only in the sense of the electoral business, but what you said earlier about the deep state. We've got to find out how this happened, who was responsible for it, who's been standing in the way, who's been not doing, who's been recommending that things that should be done not be done. See, I understand Trump is not a lawyer. If I were Trump, I would be asking these questions. I would be sitting up in the White House in the Oval Office till 2, 3 in the morning, having lines of people coming in one after another and asking these questions and telling them to get back to me in a couple of hours.
What do you think of some of have you been following any of the executive orders that POTUS has been putting out over the last couple of years?
Well, not really, no.
Because that's one of the things that we've been watching, those of us on Patriot Soapbox here. And there's some very interesting ones that have come out. And there's a lot of it, from what we've seen, is defining some of the procedures and different things that all relate to his stated mission of draining the deep state, draining the swamp. There was one in particular. It was back in January of 2018. That was quite interesting. And there's been several recently. There's been a couple that were done and weren't made public right away that have recently come out. But a lot of it seems to be in the direction of draining the deep state directly. And there's quite a few, so it's hard for me to go into all of them. But it was something that one of our listeners wanted to ask you about.
The problem with that, Thumper, and that's excellent. But the problem with all of this, and I think this is something that Edwin is alluding to, is we're running out of time.
Yes,
we're running out of time.
And who are the people? He could write an executive order. I could write an executive order. Who are the people who are going to implement that executive order? He hands this over to someone in the deep state, someone he doesn't realize is actually a deep state operative, and the thing just gets sandbagged. All right. So if I had, let me assume that he's writing executive orders that would be directed to what we see now. He foresaw this and he wrote executive orders. Mm-hmm. He also should have been looking at 10 U.S.C. Section 253 to recruit the people who are going to enforce those executive orders, right? Because apparently he can't trust very many people in his administration, or at least in the agencies. Hell, if the CIA is actually involved in this with the computer fraud aspect of it,
I don't think there's any question.
No, but let's say if. Okay, I'm like a lawyer. I'm going to look to see the evidence. But I've seen allegations, pretty strong allegations. Sidney Powell's. But if that's true, then we have a classic example of this deep state problem. And is it just the CIA? Because if you remember, Fletcher Prouty wrote a book many years ago about how the CIA was involved in planting its people all throughout the government, including throughout the military. All right. Remember, Fletcher Prouty was a colonel.
I do.
Right? And the Secret Team was the name of the book. And he was the man who had been deployed with doing some of this. So he knew what was going on, which means that you could run into essentially anybody in the FBI. You could run into anybody in the Justice Department. You could run into anybody in the Department of Health and Human Security. And this person could actually be a CIA operative. Right. And you wouldn't know it. Mm-hmm. And so there's the grave difficulty. When an administration like Trump's, which is on the outs anyway with the deep state, starts to turn to these agencies and say, I want certain kinds of action taken, is he delegating that action specifically to people who are his enemies? Mm-hmm. And he doesn't know.
Well, I found it very interesting in one of his moves here recently when he got rid of Esper and moved Miller up as the Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, well, good. Next step. Next step, right? You had Patton with his Third Army ready to invade Germany, and Eisenhower decided, well, we got to give that fuel to Monty, and the war dragged on for another 6 months, right? And I don't think Eisenhower was being disloyal, but there was a decision made, which was a very bad decision. And
it ended up with half of Germany being part of the Soviet bloc.
Yeah, it turned out to be a very bad decision. So, okay, he put this fellow in. He made this change. We assume that the new man is better than the man who was replaced. Okay, now what? We've given the gasoline to Monty. Is Monty going to cross the Rhine? No, not for another 6 months.
What he's done is he's put all special operations teams under his direct command. We know that, and he's got quite a formidable history as far as his special operations. Crying out loud! Excuse me. This Miller fellow seems quite capable. Let's put it that way.
Well, that's fine.
Let's hope he is.
All I've been saying all along is there's a very simple way to approach this. This could have been done without any specific executive orders. I would have written one for the Section 253 to cover myself. And he hasn't taken those steps. He hasn't taken what I would consider to be the normal and aggressive steps that you would take. And some people are saying, well, he's doing things behind the scenes, to which I say, well, I'll wait and see.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I want to make sure that our listeners understand the reason you feel a sense of urgency is the fact that if in fact Trump somehow doesn't get back in the White House, we're going to be moving into the New World Order. They've made it abundantly clear. They're going to adopt the Green New Deal. They've already talked about putting John Kerry in charge of a special environmental group. I mean, we're going to be looking at Agenda 2030. And they're talking about having it fully in play by 2025. People need to understand just how dire this is, because if in fact they implement all these things, they're going to be getting rid of a whole lot of people.
Right. And they can implement a lot of legislation that will be difficult to reverse. Even if you had only a 4-year Biden-Harris or Harris-Biden, however you're going to put it, administration, you could put in things like Obamacare as a classic example of that. Mm-hmm. How difficult has it been to rectify all of the failures and so forth of Obamacare? We're still trying to dig our way out from under that. And these people, with their legislative program at least, look much more aggressive than Obama did. Mm-hmm. Obama talked about fundamentally changing the country. He changed a lot of things, but not to the degree that the Harris-Biden group says they're going to do it.
Right, right. I mean, it's kind of like the frosting on the cake, and we see how deep the deep state is right now. Look how much worse it's going to be if we've got another 4 years of people that openly admit that they are socialists and Marxists and believe in all this stuff that we don't believe in.
No, that's right.
And totally antithetical to our Constitution.
That's right. Well, that's the interesting point here, that nobody seems to be saying, wait a minute, these policies are unconstitutional. Mm-hmm. It's not simply that Biden and Harris maybe aren't the best politicians we can get in, but they're proposing things that are fundamentally contrary, not only to the Constitution. When we start talking about globalism, you're talking about the Declaration of Independence.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
The so-called free and independent states that made this declaration. Free and independent of what? Of all other states around the world, including Britain. Mm-hmm. Right? And now they're attempting to reverse the Declaration of Independence.
Exactly.
We're talking about fundamental. Obama had no idea of how fundamental the fundamental change could be. Mm-hmm. But the people behind this Democratic group, they certainly understand what it is.
They do. And we're talking in such a total scale that in reality, it's very likely that we won't even have a constitution at the end of 4 years. Certainly not anything close to what the founders envisioned.
Well, you have a piece of paper called the Constitution, and then you'll have the real world, the real political world, which will be entirely different. And you look at it from the point of view of the election. We have a Constitution that has all sorts of checks and balances built into it all the way down to the state and local level, because they're part of it in the federal system, supposedly to give us honest elections. And what's happened? Mm-hmm. Half of the country saying, forget it, we don't worry about fraud. The guy was elected, that's the end of it, live with it. Mm-hmm. And the other half of the country, say this is a fundamentally fraudulent election. The person who was supposedly elected is not legitimate. What greater split in the country could you possibly have?
Absolutely.
And that's under the Constitution we have now. There's been no change in the Constitution. No one has even said, other than the Electoral College, that all the provisions of the Constitution or at the state level are somehow out of date. They don't like the Electoral College, but that's another reason. So they're supposedly saying, well, we're following the Constitution, and yet what do we see? We see something that's entirely antithetical to the Constitution. Mm-hmm. So if they'll do it at that level, at what level will they stop?
I don't think they will, and that's kind of the tragedy of this whole thing, is the fact that they keep getting away with it. They're going to do everything they fully intend to do without much resistance to it.
So that's the key.
Yeah. I think you're at a point right now in this country, and I was going to ask you this question. I think they're doing this intentionally. I think they want to start a civil war in our country. I think they're doing it. to see how far they can go and see if once we start to fight back. I think they're fully intending to, under a new administration, to make patriots in this country the enemy of the state.
Well, I think so, because if you look at some of the things that Hillary Clinton said about the deplorables, as a classic example, look at some of the things that the media nabobs have been saying about us. The idea they're going to, it was AOC, they were going to have proscription lists. She didn't call it proscription, a list. We're going to have lists of people who had been supportive of Trump or Trump's ideology or Trump's political movement, and things were supposed to happen to them.
Right.
That's the Roman proscription list. A Roman proscription list, they put the list of the people, and those were the ones who were going to be killed or exiled. Well, they can't quite get away with that yet. But they're already talking that way.
They're talking that way.
How can you live in a republic in which one group can gain political power and then essentially bastardize the other group, legally speaking and socially speaking? And they're already talking that way.
Well, they're talking that way, and they're talking things like re-education camps. I mean, that's straight out of the Soviet Union. That's straight out of communist China.
Communist China. Communist China does an even better job than Stalin ever did. Yeah. Stalin wasn't interested in